Right now, we have with us Brandon Arnold. He is the Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us here on the show.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure, Brandon. Tell us about the National Taxpayers Union.
Yeah, so we represent America's taxpayers at every level of government. I spend most of my time at the federal level, but we have a team of state, essentially lobbyists that represent the interest of taxpayers. That means lower spending, lower taxes, a more reasonable system of regulations to keep the government off of the backs of American individuals and American businesses and let this economy thrive as a result of that. So we try to represent inside the halls of Congress, in state capitals, represent taxpayer interests there right next to where the legislators are making the laws.
Certainly a worthy cause. What's your website?
www.ntu.org, NTU for National Taxpayers Union.
NTU.org. Well, thank you, Brandon. So there's a lot on the line right now, a very fluid situation in Capitol Hill with regard to, but the tax piece of this big, beautiful bill is so important. Maybe you could give us a breakdown of where it stands right now and what's at stake.
Yeah, so the House recently passed its version of the One Big Beautiful Bill, and I've been working primarily on the tax piece of that, but there's obviously a lot of other moving parts in that: additional border security, military funding, some reform to healthcare programs like Medicaid to make sure those are functioning properly and aren't busting the federal budget. So the House cleared their version a couple weeks ago, and now the Senate is piece by piece revealing portions of its bill. And they just released one of the biggest pieces yesterday evening. That is the tax piece, and also the one that touches some of those healthcare provisions. They just released that less than 24 hours ago. So our head's still spinning. We're still digging through all the details, trying to make sense of what's in there and how it differs from the House bill. This is all intended to tee up a vote in the Senate and get this bill hopefully to the president's desk before the July 4th recess. It's a pretty ambitious goal, but one they're working full steam ahead at trying to accomplish.
That's good news. So, can you comment at all about any common differences in terms of the Senate and the House proposal in terms of the bill?
Yeah, so there's a number of differences. Some relatively small. For instance, the child tax credit, a very important tax credit to a lot of families out there. What the House does is extend the $2,000 per child tax credit, gives it a temporary bump of $500 per kid for a couple years, and then reverts back to the $2,000 credit. The Senate bill takes a different approach. They immediately bump that $2,000 credit up to $2,200, so a little bit more generous, and makes that higher credit permanent. So I think that's a step in the right direction, having a more stable tax system there, more stable level of taxation, and recognizing that kids are really, really expensive right now. And then, the SALT deduction is one of the biggest issues. This is the state and local deduction,
Mm-hmm.
one that really primarily benefits states like New York, New Jersey, California, high tax states, allows people to write off the majority of their state tax burden on their federal taxes. That's effectively subsidizing bad tax and spending policy in those blue high tax states. The Senate is far less generous, thankfully, to those blue states, only providing a $10,000 deduction limit, which is what is current law, rather than the 40,000, which is way too generous and way too expensive. We're not talking chump change either. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in lost federal tax revenue that could be far better spent lowering rates, reducing the deficit, doing more pro-growth stuff. So those are just two of the big changes there. And there's several others we can dive into if you're so inclined, Bob.
Well, thank you so much for that, Brandon. And maybe we should take a step back and there's a lot at stake here. What happens if we don't pass this bill or somehow renew the tax uh, program that was set in place in 2017?
Yeah, so when that bill was passed into law back in 2017, they had to comply with some arcane Senate rules, the reconciliation process that I'm sure you've become quite familiar with, as we all have over the past few years. The reconciliation process has these strict rules, and because of those, in order to get this bill done, it had a finite lifespan for most of the provisions that we're talking about today, most of the individual provisions, those lower rates, the child tax credit, the bigger standard deduction, and so forth. And because of that, we're getting close to that end of that lifespan. At the end of this year, 2025, all of those tax cuts disappear. and more than 80% of Americans would be facing a tax hike of nearly $3,000 per filer. That's an enormous tax hike anytime, but particularly when we've seen costs just skyrocket during the Biden days. Now everything is more expensive, so people really need those $3,000 in their pockets just to pay their bills, pay their groceries, fill up their gas tanks, et cetera, et cetera. So that tax hike would be really hard on the individual families and small businesses that would have to deal with it. It would also be an economic disaster, possibly even sending us into a recession. So we need to get this bill passed to get those tax provisions locked in on a permanent basis. And I think we need to go further and make our tax code even better. And I think this bill takes some steps in that direction.
Well, thank you for that, Brandon. And it seems to me it's kind of political suicide if this thing doesn't pass. How are the senators and congressmen, are they pretty determined to get something through, or are you seeing some resistance from the likes of Rand Paul and others?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of desire to avert a tax hike. And, Rand Paul and a lot of more of the fiscal hawk community, and by the way, I sympathize with those folks. I'm a fiscal hawk myself.
Right.
They'd like to see this bill passed. They'd like to see the tax rates extended, but they are also very mindful of the fact that we have an enormous federal debt right now. We're spending on an annual basis $2 trillion more than we're taking in revenue. That is absolutely unsustainable. So I think there are provisions in this bill that move in the right direction. I'd like to see a lot more of them. I'd like to see more in the way of spending cuts. But when you're talking about only having 53 Republican senators and the barest of majorities in the House of Representatives, we're going to have to do a little give and take here. We're probably not going to get everything that we want. We're not going to be able to really make those deeper cuts that put us on a more fiscally sustainable trajectory. So I'm hoping that Rand Paul will win some victories that get him in support of this bill, move that bill into a more fiscally responsible direction. And he has a lot of friends and allies trying to move in that same direction, folks like Senator Lee and Senator Rick Scott in Florida, Ron Johnson in Wisconsin. So, hopefully we can make this bill better and more fiscally responsible.
Well, thank you for that, Brandon. And, in my mind, it seems to me this rescission process could be very important in terms of reducing the deficit. And my understanding is that right now the House has already passed $9.4 billion rescission of expenses that were to be made. And if it's approved by the Senate, then it's going to go on for the signature of the president. Isn't that a way to kind of reduce the deficit and reduce some of the expenditures we have right now?
Oh, absolutely. And yes, we're thankful that process is moving along. The White House transmitted their rescissions package, like you said, $9.4 billion. A lot of stupid, wasteful spending, things like enforcing voter ID in Haiti and Sesame Street in Iraq, and just things that the American taxpayer should not be paying one penny for. So $9.4 billion, a lot of money for you and me. I mean, we had $9.4 billion in our back pocket. We'd be very happy.
Oh, yeah.
For the federal government that spends $6.8 trillion in 2024. It's a relative drop in the bucket. It's about 0.14% of the budget. So it should be a no-brainer when we're running these massive deficits and have this debt crisis on our hands. There is a little bit of pushback, unfortunately, to even the smallest of cuts. But I'm hopeful we can get this $9.4 billion enacted into law, make that small but important cut moving in the right direction, and then go from there and build momentum.
Yeah, and absolutely, man. I'm also speaking of the process right now. Doge is just kind of getting started. They've run into some obstacles from the judiciary and so forth. But hopefully, as they continue to discover this waste, fraud, and abuse, that there can be more and more cuts that lead to even larger rescissions.
Yeah, totally agree with you there. And, I think the problem with Doge is that when you do things unilaterally, you subject yourself to more legal challenges, which is absolutely something we're experiencing right now. And then, if anything that's done unilaterally by a president can be undone unilaterally by a subsequent president.
Right.
So you don't have that durability necessarily that you really need to get these spending items off the books and start saving money on a permanent basis. That's why I think congressional involvement is really important. The president, the Congress working together, cut spending, do so in a way that's clearly legal under statute and that is not subject to any kind of judicial review.
Well, Brandon, I just really appreciate this commentary. I know we haven't touched on estate taxes and so many other things that are involved in this bill, but irrespective, it was very helpful. Brandon Arnold, Executive Vice President of the National Taxpayers Union, ntu.org is the website. Brandon, really appreciate your commentary. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Bob. Thank you.
My pleasure indeed. All right.